Please welcome my dear friend, Kathy Linaweaver.
Greetings, everyone. I want to thank John Todd for inviting me to come today and speak at the Pachyderm. As I look around, there's many of you that I have met coming here to our weekly luncheons, and I have to tell you, I am very honored and privileged to be associated with the Sedgwick County Republicans. Obviously, you know I'm a retired warden, and from sitting at various tables with you throughout our luncheons, many of you know I was born and raised in Kansas, but usually our conversation ends there. And so a lot of people wonder what I do in retirement. Now, Lori indicated a few of the things, but I tell you, I don't sit around and eat bonbons all day. I spent a lot of time with my 89-year-old parents that live in Benton. I love to go visit my nephew and niece and their 3 children that live in Keachai. And I'm able to spend a lot more time with my sons. I have my oldest son, who's actually turning 37 today, lives in Kansas City, and my 3.5-year-old granddaughter. And I have my younger son and his wife, who live in Bristow, Oklahoma, and are expecting their first child this summer. So that's what a retired warden does in their spare time. I have really been busy lately with the Republican Women United, and Myron, thank you for the plug, and I'm going to talk about it a little bit at the end, but we do have some exciting things coming up, and you all have some flyers on your table if we don't get a chance to talk about it much. When I'm not doing all of those things I just talked about, I like to keep my brain engaged in the field of corrections. I'm often called to do consultant work for GLG. I often do training for the National Institute of Corrections, and I've been doing quite a bit of auditing for facilities that hold Immigration and Customs Enforcement detainees for Creative Corrections Corporation. Now, when I look around this room, I see a lot of community leaders, and so I'm sure that all of you agree with me that learning about leadership is a lifelong process. It doesn't end when you retire. I think you also know that anybody that says there's nothing they can learn, they're probably the person that needs to learn the most. You know, everyone has to have a leadership style that's flexible. It's going to depend on the situation you're in, and you've got to be able to adapt to the people that you lead and also the societal influences that you're facing. I believe that every one of you has a unique leadership toolbox, as do I. And I believe you're constantly looking for more tools to put in your toolbox, and you turn to lessons learned in life to get many of those tools. I expect everybody's toolbox to be a little bit different, and that's okay, because the people that each of us supervise and meet along the way are all going to be different. I'll take just a literal toolbox example, if I may. If the only thing you had in your toolbox was a hammer, how well do you think that would work on unclogging a toilet? Okay, kind of a crude example, but I will tell you, it is very similar to when I started out in corrections. There was oftentimes, as an associate warden and a warden, I used my equivalent of the hammer. Hammers work great when you have an emergency situation, but I would have failed miserably if that is what I used every day, all day long. So today, I have the opportunity to tell you about my career and my journey as a little girl from Kansas to New York City and back again, with several very interesting stops along the way. And as I go through my career, I want to share with you some of my lessons learned that I have in my toolbox. I want to share those with you because good leaders share what they know. They don't hide them so that they can try to one-up somebody. I was a pre-law major at Pittsburgh State until the end of my junior year. That's when I fell in love, or at least I thought I did at 20 years old. And I decided to get married, which at the time was probably a good idea because I soon found out I was pregnant. So long story short, I gave up my career dreams. I changed my major, went to school an extra semester, and I got a teaching degree, and I got a job teaching high school speech and English in Lansing, Kansas. If you fast forward my life 7 years, I'm now a stay-at-home mom with 2 children and a husband who I found out has been cheating on me. So I was facing a divorce, lots of debt, and I had let my Kansas teaching certificate elapse. Folks, that's what today we call a hot mess. Now, if you're familiar with the Lansing-Leavenworth area, then you know that it's known for its abundance of prisons. The Kansas Department of Corrections has facilities at 3 different security levels right there in Lansing. You've got the United States Disciplinary Barracks at your military prison located at Fort Leavenworth. And you have the United States Penitentiary, which is one of the oldest federal prisons in existence. Well, since I couldn't afford to go back to school and take the 3 hours I needed to get my teaching certificate renewed, I decided I would call the prisons and see if they had any openings. Well, when I called the state, you did need a current teaching certificate. But when I called the federal prison, I found out that because they're sovereign, that I don't need a certificate, just the teaching degree, and they had a vacancy. So, my interview went very well. I got hired. I got a letter in the mail telling me what my starting salary was, what my reporting date was going to be. And as you can imagine, at that point in my life, I was thrilled. Well, about a week later, the then supervisor of education at USP Leavenworth called me. And he was doing a whole lot of stuttering and stammering and as he proceeded to try to tell me that the job I'd been hired for had been put on hold. And if they were going to fill it, they would probably fill it from someone in-house. However, in my interview, I was told no one in-house qualified for the position. So there you have it. Haven't even started my first day of work and I'm already fired. Well, I found out later that all this happened because a gentleman who was then the associate warden of custody, crusty old guy, I nicknamed him the knuckle dragger, found out that I'd been hired. I can only imagine his reaction. Bulging veins, curse words, and something to the effect of, "I'll not have a woman work in my penitentiary." So you can imagine why the guy was scared to death and had to call me and stutter and stammer and basically try to fire me. Well, the human resource manager came back to work the next day and found out what had transpired. I am sure that he went ballistic and probably told the whole bunch they were Neanderthal idiots and that if I wanted to, I could sue the government and win. Well, you know, I didn't know anything about equal employment opportunity law back then, so a lawsuit was not even in my thought process. That human resource manager, he called me, very apologetic. He said, "I'm sure you think the right hand doesn't know what the left hand's doing, but it's okay, you have a job." Lesson number 1, have faith that good people will do the right thing by you. You just have to learn who the right people are. When it came time for me to participate in the 2 weeks of required orientation at the prison, it was no surprise that I was the only woman in a class of 8 brand new correctional officers. Now, my classmates were very nice to me, but I got the strangest looks and treatment from all the instructors that came and went throughout this process. Now, at the end of the first week, one of the requirements is that the new employees participate in the 4 p.m. count of the inmates. So each of my fellow classmates was assigned to shadow an officer in a housing unit, and they all left our classroom about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Well, at 3:30, I was still sitting there. There must have been quite a discussion about what are we going to do with her. So my new ally, you know, the human resource manager, he came to my rescue. He came and got me. He says, "Look, need you to report out to the minimum security camp outside the wall, and you're going to conduct count out there." Well, evidently, Mr. Knuckle Dragger got involved, and he was under the impression the convicts, that's what he called the inmates, was convicts, that they would strip naked and go crazy if they saw a woman. But since he viewed the campers as whiny, wimps, he thought I would be safe out there. So I knew my performance with this count was going to succumb to great scrutiny. So I was sure to follow the lead of the officer, and I made sure my count was accurate. It didn't take me very long to realize those inmates weren't going to undress and act foolish. They were more concerned to get to the chow hall at the front of the line as soon as the count cleared. Well, as we walked from one dormitory to the other, and we'd probably counted about half the camp, the lead officer turned to me and he said, "So, what's it like getting visually undressed every time you walk into one of these housing units?" Well, I just responded by simply saying, "Well, I'm just doing my job, so I hadn't even thought of it." He quickly rebutted and said, "Well, you could be taking it as a compliment, so you better watch yourself." So, I turned and looked at him straight in the eye. I said, "Well, isn't it a good thing that I get enough compliments outside of work that I don't need an inmate to make my day? But thank you very much, sir, for your advice." He never said one more word the rest of the count. That's lesson 2. Keep your friends close and your enemies closer, and don't let either one of them see you sweat. My probationary year at USP Leavenworth is filled with so many stories like that. But since most of the comments I endured were very crude and very inappropriate, I typically don't tell them in a public setting like this. But anytime you want to know, ask me and I'll share. It's probably a good thing that I really didn't understand the system back then, because I could have become a very paranoid, bitter individual as I look back on all the things that people tried to do to me and the things that they said, hoping that I would fail in my probationary year when I could be fired for relatively no reason. Well, fortunately, Knuckle Dragger did me a favor. He made sure I went to the camp to teach when I got through with my training. His closed-mindedness in that decision actually allowed me to meet a wonderful woman who became my career mentor and friend. And I tell you, without her advice and wisdom, I would not be standing here today. About 6 months after I was hired, the Bureau of Prisons started hiring females in the penitentiary. Mr. Knuckle Dragger transferred out. Bye, see you. And I had the opportunity to go inside the maximum security prison and work full time. But you know what I did? I chose to stay a little longer at the camp, because had I gone inside, I wouldn't have had the mentoring. I wouldn't have had anyone to teach me. And at the camp, I got to learn all aspects of corrections. I was learning about the unit team functions. I filled in for the correctional officers, and I earned the respect of my fellow workers and of the inmates. Lesson 3. Find a career mentor early, and it's a good thing that you have more than one mentor as your career progresses. It has to be someone you respect. It has to be someone that's respected by others, and that person needs to want you to succeed. After a couple of years, I went inside of the penitentiary to work. Now, I had been going in there every week throughout my career to pick up law books and leisure reading material and other kinds of supplies. And it's such a there's such a mystique about the place. If you've ever driven by, you know it's this monstrous marble building facility that was built to represent the nation's capital with a towering dome-shaped rotunda. Now, I have to say that it's not pink as though is depicted on the Facebook page. Thank you, Mr. Weeks, for your creativity in preparation for this presentation. But I have to say, the Knuckle Draggers are turning over in their graves. Oh, if they saw that picture, I had to laugh. There is so much wonderful history. I could talk this entire time just about things about Leavenworth. If only those walls could talk. That's what I'll say about the place. But anyway, I went inside to work, and I do everything to the best of my ability. And it paid off. I was soon promoted to the position of acting assistant supervisor of education, and then I did a temporary promotion as supervisor of education, which is lesson 4. Do your job to the best of your ability, and doors will open for you. Now, it's the culture of the Bureau of Prisons that you probably are going to have to move if you're going to promote very far up. Well, by the time I had 5 years in, I knew I wanted to make a career in corrections. Now, there were still very few women at that time in upper management positions, but I could see that things were changing. I was a GS-11 teacher, and so that made me eligible for a few GS-12 positions. I got some of the best and most valuable advice from my mentor. She says, now, Kathy, you can put in for all these vacancies for GS-12 unit manager, and you can get lost in the system because there's hundreds of people in the same job. Or you can follow the career path that you started in education. Now, at the time, there were 64 institutions in the Bureau of Prisons. There's 122 now, and I'm sure that question's going to come up at the end. But I could be one of 64. It's not one of thousands. More importantly, as a supervisor of education, I was going to supervise all the education, all the recreation, a lot more employees than a unit manager, huge budget compared to unit management, and a lot of exposure to the institution's executive staff. So I applied, and I was selected as the supervisor of education at the Federal Correctional Institution in Greenville, Illinois. Lesson 5. Don't chase a paycheck. Instead, always be preparing yourself for your ultimate career goal. And in each step along the way, you've got to be willing to get out of that comfort zone. Moving away from Kansas, alone, first time, 37 years old. That's scary. You know, I went to the DMV when I first got to Greenville, and you have to fill out the paper, going to get your tags. I didn't know what county I lived in. When I was a child, I could recite all 105 counties in Kansas. I felt like a complete idiot. But then I turned to somebody in line and said, hey, what county is this? They're like, Bond. Okay. When I realized nobody even batted an eye at that question, that's when I realized moving isn't such a big deal. You know, my experience at FCI Greenville was wonderful. It was a new facility, so it didn't have that old stigma that Leavenworth had that a woman could never succeed in corrections. But my biggest regret about the 3.5 years that I did at Greenville was back then I didn't have a very diverse leadership toolbox. You know, I look back now and I recall that there was many instances that I didn't treat my employees as fairly as I should have. You know why? Because I treated them all the same. I treated them like I wanted to be managed. I had to learn the hard way that people are different. And just because somebody is different than you doesn't mean they're wrong. It simply means they're different. People communicate differently. They learn differently. That doesn't mean that they're stupid. That means that they process information differently. Lesson 6, meet people where they are. You must learn what makes them tick in order to lead and influence them. In the mid-1990s, the Bureau of Prisons was making significant strides to hiring and promoting women. So it was at this time I had the opportunity to apply for and be selected to be the Regional Education Administrator for the North Central region, whose office is located in Kansas City. Not only did this put me back closer to home, but instead of being one in 64, I was now one of 6. The Bureau of Prisons has a central office in Washington, D.C., and they have 6 regional offices throughout the United States. As one of these 6 education administrators, my job was similar to a school superintendent. I traveled to the 18 prisons that were located in my region, and I provided training and ensured policy oversight. I also traveled routinely to our training center in Denver, Colorado to conduct new teacher training, and about 4 times a year to Washington, D.C. to help revise our existing policies and write new ones. The experiences and the exposure that I got in that position was significant. It was at that point in my career I knew I wanted to be a warden someday. Now, although I had quite a few opportunities for promotions during the 5 years that I stayed in the region, I knew that that would be the last time that either of my children lived at home, so I turned down those opportunities. I made a conscious decision, and in August of 2004, I moved my son, Kyle, to college. 1 week later, I moved myself to my next duty assignment, number 4, as an associate warden at the United States Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri. Lesson 7, if it's the right job for you, it'll be there at the time that is right for you. Springfield, wow, what an interesting place. When I was there, we housed several very high-profile inmates, and I have some really interesting stories I could share about working with the mentally ill population that's housed there. I worked at Springfield for 2.5 years, and during that time, I met some more career obstacles. I was no longer a subject matter expert in the field of education. I didn't even supervise the education department. So, I had to learn to trust the subject matter experts that ran the departments that I was responsible for. I had to learn how to validate their actions, and that meant don't micromanage them if it's not necessary, but you better follow up if and when it is. Lesson 8. A good leader must be able to balance trust and validation. Now, in the Bureau of Prisons, it's customary that you serve at 2 duty stations as an associate warden before you're promoted to warden. So I remember meeting with our regional director on one of his many visits to Springfield to discuss my career aspirations. And so I eagerly said, "Sir, I'm an empty nester. I want to go somewhere where there's a challenge. I know I haven't moved out of the North Central region thus far, but I'm up to it." I'm sure I probably sounded like, Lassie chasing a bone, So he said, "Well, how about a penitentiary?" Well, I'd been a teacher at a penitentiary, so I'm like, "Oh, sure, Where's that bone at? Where's that bone at?" Lesson number 9, be careful what you ask for. Has anybody in this room, raise your hand, ever heard of or been to Inez, Kentucky? Yeah, same answer I get all the time. That's all right. It's 8 miles from West Virginia in the eastern Kentucky Appalachian Mountains. There's only 2,000 people who live in the entire county, and 50% of those live below the poverty level. Most everyone lives in a holler. And a holler is this little piece of flat ground between 2 mountains. So if you're lucky enough to get a backyard, it goes straight up a mountain. And I had a push mower. I lived 25 miles one way from a grocery store or a Walmart. That's all they had. 75 miles one way from any decent restaurant or a mall. When I'd have the few friends and family that dared come to visit me there, I'd take them to Butcher Holler, the home of Loretta Lynn, because that was our only tourist attraction. The United States Penitentiary in Big Sandy, Kentucky was a tough duty assignment. It was a relatively new penitentiary with inexperienced staff and a lot of very violent gang members. During the time that I was there, we had numerous inmate on staff and inmate on inmate assaults, and most were very serious. We had an inmate homicide, and we had to shoot 2 inmates from the center guard tower who were violently attacking other inmates. Almost every night, I received phone calls of some type of an incident, and on many occasions, I found myself turning on the police lights that were issued to me from my personal vehicle and driving over 95 miles an hour back to the institution. Now, this was the first duty station that I'd ever been where I couldn't jump in the car and drive home on the weekends. So I found myself working all the time, very isolated and very lonely. I didn't have life balance, and I knew it. That, along with the stress of the job, made me question at that time if I just wanted to hang it up when I first became eligible to retire while I was there in 2010. Now, looking back now, I'm glad I toughed it out. And that's lesson number 10. You don't learn nearly as much from the things that are easy as you do those things that present you with hard obstacles and you have to make tough decisions. Well, it all worked out. And in January of 2011, I relocated as the warden of the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Chicago, Illinois. Yes, I moved from living in a holler to living in a suburb of Chicago, but I can truly tell you I loved every minute of it. I rode a commuter train to work every day and walked a mile from the train station to the institution. I made great friends that I still keep in touch with and frequently go and see in Chicago. I loved having people come and visit so that I could take them to the many fascinating and beautiful places that city has to offer. Now, being a warden is a huge, huge responsibility. I had over 250 staff and over 700 inmates. And if you're not careful, it was a pretrial detention center, you can make some wrong decisions. And you find yourself in front of a man like Judge Journey, and they don't care whether you're a warden. You're getting yelled at and you're getting scared, and that bench is about 100 feet up in the air. I'm telling you, I did sweat. And I quickly realized I never wanted to wear an orange jumpsuit. So I paid attention when those men and women spoke. While I was warden at Chicago, we made a lot of physical plant upgrades, much needed at that 40-year-old facility. And we received outstanding marks on numerous external audits. So I was very proud in 2012 when I was named the North American Association of Wardens and Superintendents Warden of the Year. Following a wonderful ceremony where all my friends and coworkers and family attended in Denver, Colorado, I was soon notified that I had been selected to be the warden of the Metropolitan Correctional Center in New York and had been appointed to the senior executive service ranks of the federal government. Now, there's two things that a warden never wants to have happen on their watch. One, the death of a staff member at the hands of an inmate. And two, an escape. Unfortunately, on December the 18th, 2012, while I was on my house hunting trip in New York City, I got a phone call that I will never forget as long as I live. Now, when a phone call starts out, "Warden, sure hope you're sitting down," you know it's not going to be good. We had two inmates who had constructed a makeshift rope and had escaped out of a 17-floor cell window about the size of a number 10 envelope. Folks, that was a long day trying to get back to Chicago, followed by many long days trying to piece together the events that brought on that escape, and long days of pure agony with the fear that those two escaped felons were going to harm someone in the community that I had vowed to protect just so they wouldn't get reapprehended. Well, fortunately, both of them were returned to the MCC without incident, but my world would never be the same. It wasn't just the ridicule I took from the media that upset me, although I can tell you I have a much better appreciation now of how wrong they can spin a story. What hurt me the most was the look on the faces of so many of my staff who felt ashamed, even though the majority of them had nothing to do with the event. To see them so deflated, You know, there's many lessons that I learned from that event, but the one I'm sharing with you today is my number 11. You can go from hero to zero really quickly, so you better stay humble. Now, the Bureau of Prisons has a mandatory retirement age of 57, so I knew that MCC New York would be my last duty station, and so I kind of joked at first about moving there. I said, oh, it's just going to be Chicago on steroids. I didn't know at the time how big the needle was. Folks assigned to the 2 federal detention centers in the New York area have the opportunity to live in government-owned housing in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn. Well, the cost of living anywhere else in that city is so ridiculous, it was an easy decision for me. So, every morning, I got up at 4 a.m. and I walked my 2 dogs, and I got on the subway and rode it into Manhattan. Every evening, I arrived back home at 5:30, and I walked my dogs. Then I walked again to either the grocery store or the dry cleaners or the nail place, anywhere that you and I, living here, drive to. Then I'd walk my dogs one last time, and then I'd go to bed because I had to do it all the next day again. You know, New York City is a beautiful place to visit, but a very grueling place to live. I didn't have much time during the week to do anything, but the weekends were wonderful. I had lots of visitors. And I got to see 9 Broadway shows where I lived while I was there, and I ate at some of the most fantastic restaurants you'll ever get an opportunity to go to. Now, my original plan, I had my career planned out my whole life. I was going to retire in April of 2015 before they put me out to pasture in November, and I had to look at the snowfall. But then at that Christmas prior, or maybe it was January of 2014, I found out that my then 86-year-old dad had been diagnosed with thyroid cancer. And I knew that the difference that I could make if I came back here for him would far exceed anything I could do in 1 year remaining in my career with the Federal Bureau of Prisons. Lesson number 12. When you look in the mirror, you are your very own judge and jury, so the decisions you make are the ones you have to be able to live with. So I left the Bureau of Prisons on May 31st, 2014 with 24 and a half years of experience that spanned 7 duty stations. During my career, the Bureau afforded me to go to Canada, Mexico, and many, many places in the United States I would have never had the opportunity to go to if it had not been for my career. I have made lifelong friends, and more importantly, I am happy, I'm healthy, I'm self-sufficient, I can do all the things I'm doing, or I can do nothing and sit back and enjoy life. In closing, I want to share something with the women that are here today that I think is very relevant to our career success. Yes, women have made great strides to become equal with their male counterparts in the workforce, but we're still lacking in some very key areas. Specific, women are still guilty of working ourselves out. We think we have to take on all the added responsibilities and work, thinking we have to do it all just to get ahead. And as a result, we don't take care of ourselves. We don't eat right, we don't rest right, we don't exercise, and all of that stress festers like a pimple on the forehead of a teenager. I don't know about you, but I don't want to work for a cyclops. Did you get that? They act like a cyclops too. All right. Studies show that women actually score higher on overall competencies for senior leadership positions than their male counterparts. Yay! However, it's our lack of confidence and our inability to demonstrate that we have well-rounded experiences, especially in those high-risk and high-visibility assignments. This is what continues to derail us from achieving top leadership positions. Therefore, I challenge all of you women, and go out there and challenge the women that you know and that you mentor. Get out of your comfort zone. You can start out with anything, and it can be small. If it's a new hairstyle, If it's that outfit that you love, but your girlfriends say, I wouldn't be caught dead in that. It might be writing an article for your favorite magazine, or it might be putting in for that dream job. Whatever it is, remember what I said. You have to leave your comfort zone, because after a while, the boundaries of that zone become so thin, you can walk right in and right out without letting them ever see you sweat. That's it, folks. I'm ready for questions.
Come over to the judge first.
How did I know?
I would never yell at you. There seems to be quite a bit of issues in the federal prison system right now with private prisons. I was wondering if you could expand a little bit on your experience in dealing with them and supervising them, and are they worth the money we're going to save, allegedly?
All right. I'll start out by telling you what the history is of private prisons to begin with. In the early 2000s, the federal government had an initiative called A76, and every agency was required to perform cost analysis of various programs to determine if they could be outsourced. The Bureau of Prisons, complied with that in many of their different aspects: health care, food service. I was at Springfield at the time. We did a cost analysis of our dialysis program. As a result of that, it was determined that low and minimum security inmates could be housed cheaper in a private prison than in the federal system. Thus, the first private prison, and it's still in existence today, FPP, Federal Private Prison, Taft, California. Since then, there's been numerous prisons built and numerous companies that provide private prisons to the Bureau of Prisons for minimum and low. Not for your highs, not for your mediums. If you understand the benefit package and what is entailed in the cost of a federal government employee, particularly in corrections, because we have a different pay scale, with our retirement program and such, you can see why it's cheaper to have have it privatized. Our entire budget is so salary heavy. When I was warden, I had a $39 million salary budget and only a $5 million operating budget. The cost is in the manpower. And so to the extent of your question, do I believe in private prisons? Yes, because if you know much about the federal sentencing guidelines, you know we locked up everybody and anybody in the 90s, and we couldn't build private prisons as fast as we needed them. And there's a lot of things about private prisons that haven't been covered in the news because the initiative was given to the DOJ. The initiative has not yet been given to the Department of Homeland Security, which has all of those ICE detainees that I just mentioned. And you know how many there are? Lots. Are they going to come back underneath the federal government, and how are we going to afford it? So to the extent of your question, I think a knee-jerk reaction was made because a couple of private prisons got a black eye. You never hear about the good things prisons do. There's a lot of great programs going on. You hear when somebody screws up. And is there a profit? Yes. But are they still doing it cheaper than the federal government? Yes. So in my answer, I say we keep them, maybe regulate them a little bit more, but I don't see them going away.
Right here, Carl.
What observations would you have about the types of prisoners that come into the system over your experience and tenure?
Back when I started, we had a lot of mafia. You always wanted the mafia guys, your orderly. Quiet, clean unit, never any problems. Quickly, because of the sentencing guidelines, I became inundated with drug offenses, young men in their 20s, that were doing life, no less than 40 years. You could have robbed a bank when I started in the 90s and only get 25 years, but the drug dealer was getting 40 to life because a lot of the conspiracy laws. What I tell a lot of people when I do a lot of leadership training for people in regards to working in the mixed generations. You know, you all out there working, you know what it's like to supervise the millennials and all that fun stuff. Well, guess what? We have millennial inmates, and their mama said, you're going to be the best drug dealer you could ever be. You can go to the top, just like our employees. You know, you can call the warden. You can be anything you want to be. So there you have it.
Kathy, an issue, of course, that's controversial in America that you may have a more informed perspective on than most people is the utility, desirability, effectiveness of the death penalty. And then kind of related to that, now I think that there's controversy about extreme segregation measures as a form of punishment, such as, I guess an extreme case would be the federal prison in Florence, Colorado, where like the Unabomber and people like that are held.
Yes, I can speak to both of those issues. I am on the Policy and Resolution Committee for the American Correctional Association, and we just passed about 6 months ago new audit standards for that are used nationwide, state, private, federal, for the reviews of restrictive housing. Again, I think people watch too much television and they called it solitary confinement. It's not solitary confinement. You have staff from all departments in there every day, numerous times a day, talking to these individuals. And trust me, if we can get them out of special housing, we do. But some of them cannot function in an open population. I've been to the administrative max numerous times in my career. It's a very humane institution. It's overpacked. It's probably housing about 400 of the nation's worst. And you have to understand, sometimes they're in there for their own protection. Look what happened to Jeffrey Dahmer when he was in a state system and was allowed to go out into general population. There's many reasons we have people in restrictive housing. It is not a black hole in the ground where you get in and we throw you some bread and water. I think the biggest disservice that we ever did is we didn't take people on tours of our special housing unit when they came. My doors were always open. I always brought lots of college students, lots of senators and Republicans, lots of judges on tours. But we had that nice little tour path that went to all the program areas, and then they left. So the mystery remained of what do they do down there in that special housing unit, and they call it the hole, and they call it the box, and there's all kinds of names for it. And so I understand we're going to get scrutiny from outside, but what I can tell you is if you were to come with me to a special housing unit and see some of those characters, not a lot of them, but there's a certain number that you'd say, oh my goodness, don't let them out while I'm here. So, now the death penalty real quick. I worked in the regional office when we wrote the execution protocol and helped on the team that was in charge of the execution of Timothy McVeigh and 2 subsequent executions thereafter. We allow our employees the chance to opt out if they choose not to participate in the death penalty. That is strictly their choice. I will tell you that on the form that I had to fill, I said I will fulfill whatever responsibility is given to me. My philosophy is I am there for them to carry out the sentence, whatever the sentence is. And if we have to shoot an inmate from the center tower, we didn't carry out that sentence. We allowed death by cop. They call it suicide by cop because that inmate knew what was going to happen and he chose to do it anyway because he didn't want to do his life sentence. So I take that very seriously. Timothy McVeigh is the only case that we have had where all appeal rights were stripped from the beginning. I don't know that that's necessarily the way we can go, but if we have definitive evidence in this day of DNA, it's much better than some of these cases that are looming from years ago. But I can say that it's costing us an incredible amount of money to go through the approximately 25 years of appeals to carry out an execution. As a result, our special confinement unit, we don't call it death row in the Bureau of Prisons, it's called the Special Confinement Unit at the United States Penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana, is overflowing. There's a lot of reasons it's overflowing, not just the appeals, but because the The decision that the types of drugs we were using in our lethal injection were maybe questionable. The person who always remains anonymous that pushes that last button, there's issues with that. There's a lot of problems that I think if we would take it seriously on a case-by-case basis, we could move forward. Right now, we're not moving anywhere. We're spinning our wheels and we're spending a lot of money. And I don't think that's necessarily good for the inmates, the staff, or the taxpayers.
Kathy, you addressed the staff's attitude towards women in the correctional system. Was there anything unique that you found in regards to the inmates and their reactions or interactions with women in corrections?
Absolutely. You know, from that very first day when I said the inmates were more concerned about getting to the chow hall than they were doing anything inappropriate. A prison is a small society. Although it be fishbowl-like, it is a small society. We have everything inside that fishbowl that we have out here. We have the hospital, and we have the store, and we have the school, and we have the church, you know, and we have the jail inside the jail, restrictive housing. In society, women have a very calming effect. We are organizers. We do a lot. That's what they do in prison. I would venture to say prisons would not be as safe if you did not have females. And for me and every woman I mentored, I can tell you that if you treat an inmate with mutual respect, 99% of them will treat you with mutual respect back. I never had a problem.
Why can't prisoners, convicts, be forced to pay their fare? In other words, manufacturing jobs or whatever. I know companies on the outside say we don't want that competition, but we, the taxpayer, I think would like that.
There is a law that was passed for federal inmates to pay for part of their incarceration. Unfortunately, there is so much red tape with that in the 20 years I've known that law to be in existence, there are probably only a couple of people that have ever paid anything. Now, I can tell you that the Kansas Department of Corrections does a much better job. You know, they bring private factories into their prisons, the inmates work there, and they're required to pay 50% of their living, and they're paying their restitutions and their fines. They're required to save like 30% of what they make in a savings account for their release. You know, I wish that we had better programs like that. In the Bureau of Prisons, because of exactly what you said, hey, you know, you're stealing jobs from us, we have lost our sole source in federal prison industries known as Unicor. Unicor factories used to be at all prisons, and they were learning a trade, they were learning to get up and go to work and be responsible, and they were making a little bit of money and sending it home instead of calling their grandmas on the phone and begging for money when grandma is on fixed income. I've heard the phone calls, it's terrible. So, you know, we have a real dilemma when it comes to you know, getting them back to work. I don't necessarily know the answer, but I can tell you that everything changes and everything stays the same. Hang around another 20 years and I'll bet you we go back to it.
Last question, if you could change one thing in the criminal justice system, what would it be?
In 1987, they did away with the Federal Parole Commission. To be quite honest, those people didn't have any checks and balances, and they were running renegade. And they made the wrong people mad. And when you make the wrong people mad in high places, you go bye-bye. And so we did away with the ability for anybody that does change to get out. And I've seen 3 sentencing guideline changes in my career. And none of them, yeah, there's a few cuts for participating in some education programs and some drug programs, but nothing like we could have if we gave these people an opportunity to be released and come back out into society.
After Linaweaver, let's give her a big